probably we can start yes, there we go. The first half we will record, and then when we get into the next half, the last half, the breakouts, then we'll stop the recording. All right, so I will share my screen now. And nope, that's not what I want. Oh, there we go. I am there. Nope, that's not what happened. Hold on. Back to share screen. Back to presentation. There we go. That's what should be showing now. And again, there we are. So the title of this presentation is What Work-Related Risk Factors Do MSIs and Psychological Injuries Have in Common? And we have two presenters. Dr. Dwayne Van Eerd is a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health, where he has been a researcher since 1997. He has a Master of Science and Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology from the University of Waterloo, Master of Science in Health Research Methodology from McMaster University, and a PhD in Work and Health from the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo as well. As a scientist with the Institute of Work and Health, he focuses primarily on the prevention of musculoskeletal disorders, as well as the implementation of programs and practices to prevent work injury and disability related to physical and mental health. His research projects include evaluations of participatory ergonomics interventions, evaluations of workplace MSDs, and mental health practices programs and their implementation, and systematic reviews of the prevention literature. Mr. Van Eerd also practices and researches integrated knowledge transfer and exchange. And along with him, we also have Heather Johnston. Now, Dr. Heather Johnston is a Ralph McGinn postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Work and Health, funded through Safe Work BC. She holds a PhD in kinesiology and health science, as well as a diploma in health psychology from the York University in Toronto. She earned her Master of Science in kinesiology from Dalhousie University in Halifax. With a background in biomechanics and ergonomics, Johnston's earlier research investigated musculoskeletal function, musculoskeletal disorders, and the measurement of workspace design. Having learned through this research of the strong connection between musculoskeletal function and psychological modifiers, Johnston adopted an interdisciplinary approach to research, largely encompassed by the biopsychosocial model. Her interdisciplinary approach lends itself well to her practice as an associate ergonomist, in which she is passionate about optimizing the interaction among a worker, their work, and their environment to prevent work-related injury. Johnston's current research explores the association between work-related MSDs and work-related psychological injuries to improve occupational health and safety programs, policies, and practices. Her research examines what these burdensome injuries have in common with respect to shared work-related risk factors, hazards, and occupational health and safety strategies to address them. And even a practicing ergonomist sometimes gets a mouthful of all these words. So don't worry if you call them MSIs, MSDs, psychosocial what, we're all in this together. All right, so I will turn this over now. I will stop sharing. And I'm sorry, Heather, did you want me to put up the PowerPoint or would you?
No, it's all good, Andrew. Thanks for the introduction. I'll just get this shared and confirm with you that you can see slides.
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. And on the terminology part, I think we'll have a little bit on that with Dwayne in a few moments anyways. It's one of the beauties of MSDs, MSIs, and all the confusion in between. But just before we get started, I just want to say I'm very grateful to be speaking with you all today from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I just also wanted to acknowledge that while we strive to make this presentation appealing to different learning types, we recognize it's not entirely accessible. So if there's any accommodations we can make after the session, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to help with that. So a brief outline of what we'll go through today. We've got a bit of time here together and we're hoping that this can be fairly informative both for us and for you. So we will go through about 20 to 25 minutes where we will do a bit of a review from last year and pull out some psychosocial factors in the literature and kind of see how they apply to some different case scenarios. But then we will spend a good chunk of time in some breakout sessions, as mentioned earlier, using a fun little activity called Mural, or maybe that's just the teacher in me thinks that it's fun in our virtual environment. And there we're really hoping that we can categorize some of these psychosocial risk factors, list some different tools and techniques that you're familiar with, and discuss challenges that are coming up in your workplaces, really as a means to kind of help one another solve some of these challenges. And then we'll come back together at the end of that just quickly to kind of report on what we found in those breakout sessions, and then revisit just an example of a case scenario and list some of the tools and techniques we currently have for psychosocial factors, and then describe some of the next steps that Dwayne and I are taking in our research. And so just very quickly, we had a great introduction there given by Andrew on our bios. And so both of our backgrounds really stem from kinesiology, mine specifically in biomechanics and ergonomics. And as mentioned, more interest now in health psychology. And some of the previous research interests include musculoskeletal mechanisms of injury and workspace design and injury prevention. And similarly, Dwayne has interest in workplace injury prevention of work disability, and research to practice. He also practices knowledge transfer and exchange with the Institute. And so just to start us off, I wanted to find out a little bit more about everyone that's here. And so if we can get Tiffany to share our polling question, we're curious about your roles and if you, as part of your job, do identify or assess injury risk factors at a workplace.
So Heather, it looks like some issue on my end. Can you see? Can you see?
I can see. I think we've got about
Awesome.
22 who have participated so far, and that's looking great. So right now, it's seemingly that quite a few of you are assessing injury risk factors. Some are not. But perhaps some of this information will still be valuable as you're creating some of your health and safety programs and policies in the workplace. So I'm going to share results. I'm not sure if there is a cap on that, Tiffany. I've seen that only 22 were able to participate, so I'll share those. And it's great. I see that some people are also putting their function or role in the chat. So please feel free, if the polling system is not working, to use the chat function. And so now that we know a little bit about you, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dwayne as a nice little refresher from last year's RSI Day to go over the brief timeline he gave on MSI and psychosocial hazards. So Dwayne, I'll pass to you and you can tell me to work through the slides.
Hey, thanks. And I promise not to go through all 40 years of this, so it won't take long. Next, please. So in the RSIs, as this was RSI Day, or is RSI Day, seemed to emerge around the mid-80s. There was a particular epidemic, as it was called, in Australia, where upper extremity disorders were noted. So the key thing I wanted to mention about sort of the origin, if you will, of RSI, or musculoskeletal injuries, was that they were very difficult to figure out. People didn't know where they were coming from, so they were invisible. You couldn't tell if somebody was injured. They were hard to manage. They affected people differently. Two people could be sitting beside each other, one having symptoms and one not. So that sparked a whole lot of different terminology, a lot of concern about whether or not this was a real thing. As the research started to take hold, the focus was on what's causing this, how do we diagnose it and treat it, and the focus was on the physical risk factors. So repetition, duration, posture, and force were the focus of the research community. Next slide, please. And fast forwarding to the 2000s, a lot of epidemiological research was done. The physical factors were well established. It was also very well established that it was work related, which was a big concern in the early days. And early on, psychosocial factors were researched, but the physical factors were the thing that was most focused on. In the 90s, we heard about studies where workers would return to work more quickly after musculoskeletal injury if they liked their boss or versus if they didn't like their boss. So psychological factors were taken into account, but they were, let's say, haphazardly studied, if that's a word. There was a lot of focus on interventions. How do we solve this issue of MSIs, including psychosocial? So the key things that were emerging in the 2000s were job demands and control, effort-reward balance, and some of the other psychosocial factors that started to emerge around this time. Next slide. And while not explicitly related to RSI or MSI, wanted to point out that in 2013, the Workplace Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace came out. And really the key for this slide is to highlight that mental health and psychological injuries were invisible, hard to manage, and affected people differently. So where did we hear that before? So there was lots of confusion about MSIs early on. We've heard from the COO of the center that MSDs are better understood now, better treated. We're making some headway. So we know we can get there with psychological injuries as well. And next slide. So jumping forward to today, I wanted to emphasize, in light of that wonderful news that we're doing better at dealing with MSDs and MSIs, they are really on the back burner these days. We have lots of new concerns in the workplace related to COVID, some remote work, hybrid work, mental health and psychological injury are taking a lot of research bandwidth up and a lot of emphasis on that in workplaces. So while that is true, I think it's really important to remind that, yes, there's still a third or more when you go across Canada of claims related to MSIs. So we think that it's important to remind people, and maybe this is not a bad time as people are going back to work in different ways, that MSI is still an issue. And we're trying to think about research that looks at the combination of these things to maybe make it easier to identify and have workplaces deal with this in a better way. And I'll turn it back over to Heather now.
Great, thanks, Dwayne. So as Dwayne's mentioned and kind of alluded to in our bios, we really do have an interest in what is related between these two types of injuries, not just because of the trajectory that's been going on in workplaces, but also because we see that there's probably some similarities, and it's not just in terms of how we diagnose them or their chronicity and measurement, but actually in some of the factors and risk factors that we see in workplaces. And so we'll spend a bit of time today just talking about kind of what we know and what we see kind of overlapping already, and kind of where we're trying to take some of this research, and also ask for your help in kind of understanding what you see in workplaces and what's related between these two in the workplaces that you're in right now, or even maybe some of the emerging concerns you see going on with COVID and the return to work. And so I will just highlight what psychological injuries kind of look like in workplaces currently. And so in Manitoba, psychological injuries are a compensable claim. And here there's kind of two mechanisms behind that. A compensable claim could be as a result of a physical injury or with no physical injury attached to it as well. And in the definitions of psychological injuries, some things that I wanted to pull out, and I've kind of highlighted them in bold and the third bullet point here, is that it can be due to a traumatic event or accumulation of traumatic events. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I'm just kind of forecasting this for us. And that's due to the nature that many of the different events that we see for MSI might have a similar type of pattern, in that it could be very acute, or it could be kind of accumulation of things. So kind of keep that in mind, and we'll kind of parallel the two types of injuries, being musculoskeletal and psychological injuries. And going back to what Jamie mentioned, it's wonderful to know that claims are decreasing for musculoskeletal injuries in workplaces. However, we do know that across Canada, we see that accounting for 40 to 50% of all work-related claims. And more recently, we are trying to address this issue with psychological injury. When we look at some of the stats coming out of CAMH, so the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, we know that weekly over 500,000 Canadians are reported to miss work due to a mental illness. And so that becomes kind of interesting in how we approach workplace health as ergonomists, health and safety professionals, or whatever role that you take in your workplace. And so here we're describing that there's many similarities potentially between these types of injuries. And so what we want to kind of focus in on today are these risk factors and drawing out what risk factors are the same. So just to start, we'll think right now, I'm just asking the question, do you feel that psychosocials are important to consider for musculoskeletal injuries currently? And maybe you can think about your own workplaces. Are they important? Are they being considered, or maybe not so much recently? It's fantastic to see everyone's pulling away. Awesome. And Tiffany, if you don't mind ending, can you display the results of that poll? And so hopefully folks can see this, but basically an overwhelming yes, that psychological and psychosocial factors are important for musculoskeletal injuries. And it's not surprising that all of us with an interest in this would say yes to this. But I think what we might struggle with as we kind of move forward is convincing maybe our workplaces that these are very important as well. And so what would a presentation be without some sort of working model? But the reason I wanted to kind of bring in the healthy workplace model, so this was introduced by the World Health Organization in 2001, I believe it was. They talked about different avenues of influence in which we could basically change or help create a healthy workplace. And the two that I really wanted to hone in on are the concepts of the physical work environment and the psychosocial work environment. So even back in 2001, these were two kind of key constructs that we understood that we could have some sort of influence on in our workplaces. And while there's been so much work done in physical work environment, and we see that in the history of MSI prevention in terms of understanding those physical workplace factors and the amount of interventions with those, the psychosocial work environment is equally important. And here, a key thing that we see in these circles is that they overlap. It's pretty hard to impact one and not impact the other. And so that's kind of something we want to consider as we move forward. So beyond the biomechanics and physical demands, understanding psychosocial factors allows us to really emphasize some of the worker responses to different psychological conditions or the accumulation of psychological considerations over time, and to explore workplace organizational factors, which sometimes can be left out if we take more of just that physical or biomechanical traditional approach. And so previously, psychosocial factors have been defined. And if we turn to the World Health Organization and the International Labor Associations, we'll see that psychosocial factors really are kind of this all-encompassing term. We look at interactions between and among the work environment, job content, organizational conditions, and worker capacities. So this isn't unlike probably lots of our training in ergonomics, looking at that worker-task environment relationship. We know that we can't just study one of them. We want to kind of consider all of these factors together. And much like Karen described in her presentation, that there's these multiple layers that we really need to start picking at and digging into to understand psychosocial factors. Workplaces also consider that these are psychological responses to work and work conditions, potentially causing psychological health problems. So even more so now with the standard being implemented, the psychological health and safety standard, we see this emphasis on psychosocial factors really kind of going towards the psychological wellness, which I think us from the RSI side or the MSI side are kind of, we want to start remembering that they do have impacts on musculoskeletal injuries as well. And a potential limitation that I want to highlight in much of what we see with psychosocial risk factors is that there tends to be this kind of interchange between the term psychosocial and psychological, and that's going to be kind of at the user's discretion of how they want to define these factors. I think earlier in my bio it was mentioned that I'm interested in the biopsychosocial model. And so really we can have these physical, biological characteristics, we can have psychological characteristics and social. So I think that we kind of need to mirror all of those different facets rather than just calling these psychological factors. I think there are some that really do overlap the two domains. So to go into some psychosocial factors, what I wanted to pull out were two kind of historic models and which relate to factors that provide evidence of psychosocial factors, both for MSI and psychological injury. And the first that we're going to talk about is the job demand control model. And this has been around since the 1980s. So it really fits nicely with the timeline that Dwayne presented earlier, in that it was one of the most widely studied models of occupational stress. And the key idea behind this was that job control can kind of buffer the impacts of job demands on strain and can help enhance employees' job satisfaction with opportunity to engage in new challenging tasks or perhaps learn new skills. So that there was this kind of balance, we could call it, in gaining skills versus just having a high strain job. And so in this diagram here, what we see is that we have job decision or job control latitude on kind of our y-axis, if we were to look at it this way. And then on our x-axis, we have job demands. And then in the center, we're talking about the different type of jobs that might kind of occur because of some sort of interaction of job control and job demands. And so in the definition of this original model, we looked at the inner kind of boxes as a composite measure called job strain. Strain can kind of be interpreted in a few different ways when we think of RSI, but here we were really kind of referring to when job demands are high and then our job control is low, we're kind of situating ourselves with high strain jobs. So these would be ones in which some sort of injury might occur, be that occupational stress injury or musculoskeletal injury. Now, with the job control, so on our y-axis here and the job decision latitude, we're really looking at kind of two constructs, both personal discretion and job skills. So whether you kind of perceive that you have the skills available and the control to be able to do that. And then more narrowly, if we're looking at the kind of conceptual, the original conceptual model of job control, which is really, do we have any control over our work environment and the work and the tasks that we're doing? And so being able to kind of balance these two things is important. But what was also pointed out in this model is that there's some things that can impact this. And one of those key things was social support. And so social support was highlighted as the psychosocial, we'll call it risk factor, that could be both beneficial or hindering, depending on if it was available or not, or if it was supporting in the right way. And we saw that kind of in relationships, and this goes back to 2000s, 2006, where having that social support within this job demand control model could help buffer both mental disorders and MSIs like back pain. Now here, I just wanted to highlight under that model, that job demand control model, that there's tons of different examples we can see in workplaces of psychosocial factors. So here I've just highlighted a few, and this is not an exhaustive list, but we could see that monotonous work, different time pressures, high concentration or responsibilities and workload. Breaks also come into play, as well as the clarity of a job, as well as the control and autonomy. And some of these factors, the reason I kind of pull them out and highlight them is that they're not just seen in one industry, but if you look through the literature, you can see that they're displayed in manufacturing, nursing, office work. And so while there's data to suggest that that they're important for psychological injury, there's equally data to support that they're important in musculoskeletal injury. And we'll talk later in the presentation about how we assess and measure this, but predominantly we see a lot of these measures being reported as self-report. So actually going to an employee and asking kind of what job demands look like for them. The second model and kind of list of factors that I wanted to pull out for psychosocial factors related to both MSI and psychological injury was the effort reward imbalance model. And again, a historic model, it's been around for quite some time. And this one here is again, a theoretical model on the psychosocial work environment. And here we're kind of basing an assumption that there should be kind of this balance, and it's indicated kind of by the figure we see here. A balance between the relationship of the work done and the socially kind of defined rewards. And so here, if we look at an employee's health, kind of being somewhere in that balance, we're going to balance between the rewards they receive. So that might be wage, salary, the esteem or job promotion and job security. But then that's also balanced with the demands and the obligations that are given to them or imposed on them. And so in this model, it was suggested that if there is an imbalance consisting of high performance and low rewards, this is creating an increased risk of stress-related disorders if it occurs over time. And so those stress-related disorders can be a musculoskeletal injury, pain, as well as some of the psychological injuries that we see. Now, an important thing with this model is it kind of expanded beyond the one that I just talked about with the job demand controls, because they also focused in on a personal coping strategy. And I think this is where some of the challenges with psychosocial factors become, in that we start to bring in factors that are kind of extraneous to the work environment, maybe extraneous to our control as occupational health and safety practitioners, as ergonomists. We can't really control someone's individual factors. So for example, in this model, they talk about overcommitment, and that's a motivational pattern, which generates excessive commitment in conjunction with the expectations of high reward. And so people with this personal characteristic can be at increased risk of developing stress-related disorders. And the reason I wanted to kind of talk about that within this model is that this is where the waters get quite muddy. And really in our interest in the research world is like, what can we tangibly impact within the workplace, but also keep in mind that there's these other factors in the psychosocial realm that may impact the relationship that's going on. And so within the effort reward imbalance examples, we can look at effort, some parallels here with job demands and job control, but being time pressure, lots of responsibilities. Here we can even see the overlap with the physical demands. So there we're not just talking anymore about psychosocial factors, it's almost biopsychosocial factors if we look at the biological characteristics or the biomechanics behind physical demands. Then also looking at the structure of the work environment. So what if they're working overtime? The other kind of balancing piece in reward is really kind of coming from the organizational factors, such as those from the supervisor. So are you getting respect from your colleagues and your supervisor? Are you getting the job promotion and prospects that you're hoping for? Adequate salary and income and support. And so the reward domain kind of usually gets bubbled into three kind of constructs in workplaces where we look at job security, esteem, and job promotion. And so again, here at the top, I've highlighted that this kind of is a ratio that when we're looking in workplaces and trying to figure out, are psychosocial factors going to have an impact on the musculoskeletal injuries that I see in a workplace, we have to recognize that it's going to be kind of a balance between multiple different factors that are going on. And that's not unlike what we see with physical factors. So I'll pull to another polling question, and I'm curious of which of the following you would consider to be risk factors for MSI, and you can choose all that apply, hopefully here. So if you can go ahead and fill out this polling question, that would be great. And there's, I think, 10 different ones that you can look through. I see lots of great responses coming in. So as you're filling this out, I'll kind of fill the air with some interesting comments from this. So hopefully I'm not spoiling it for those that are still filling it out. But if you've seen these factors before, it's probably not a surprise. I've seen lots of work on the Manitoba websites regarding the psychological health and safety standard. And so many of these risk factors you're reading right now are actually the psychological health and safety standards. But it's fascinating. And I think this is where I see the similarities and the parallel. And I think many of you are seeing the similarities and parallel between these psychological risk factors, or so-called, and MSI. So we've already started kind of seeing that there's a relationship here. So I think a couple more we're just filling out. But Tiffany, if you do want to display some.
Oh, there we go. Stop sharing.
So hopefully, are you able to see the results?
Yep, we can see them.
Fantastic. So it is interesting for me to see kind of this overlap that's going on. And I think this will be kind of the fun part as we move forward in understanding psychosocial factors, kind of as health and safety professionals, as ergonomists, as researchers, we can start drawing from some of this literature and the psychological standard that might help us have a better concrete idea of psychosocial factors for MSI. And so with the evidence that some psychosocial risk factors impact both of these types of injuries, I wanted to also ask maybe what else do these risk factors have in common? So what might be similar between them? And I want to draw back actually to our understanding of physical risk factors. And so historically for MSIs, this was mentioned a while ago, but we know that force, posture, repetition, vibration, we know these things all impact MSI. What we also know about this is that there's kind of common modifiers behind these. And so we could look at trauma or the acuteness of an injury, or we could also call that magnitude, in which kind of how much of an impact does it have. We can also look at frequency and duration. So these characteristics of a risk factor are very important for us to start interpreting if it will indeed cause an MSI or not. And the reason I want to pull this out is that we can parallel some of these between psychological injuries. And so here I'm going to just show some images, and I want to think about these physical risk factors that we know of. And I want to also think of the scenario, and then I'm going to pull to the biomechanics within me and the biological concepts and pull to talk about our body's tissue tolerances. And so if we look at this gentleman who's lifting some sort of heavy pallet, and we'll say that, you know, over time, our tissue has a certain tolerance. So if we were looking, let's say, at back pain, we'd know that some of the tissues in our spine have a certain tolerance level before they would have an MSI or some sort of injury. However, if this gentleman was to pick up a box that was over a recommended weight limit, we know that the area in red here, if we're kind of following that load that's experienced by the spine, if at a certain point it exceeds what the tissue's tolerance is, well, we have an increased risk. So this area in red here would be an increased risk for a musculoskeletal injury. We'll call it here maybe low back pain. Now, I'm not going to show an image here, but what I want you to parallel with that kind of figure is some sort of acute trauma, being a psychological trauma, in which maybe at a workplace, a colleague witnesses a traumatic event, such as a large injury for another colleague getting injured. And so if you witness that event, there's a chance that maybe it was traumatic enough in that red zone, again, that it could create some sort of psychological injury. And so while now we're not talking about our body's tissue tolerance, this is almost just kind of our tolerance to some sort of psychological scenario, or our perception of what's going on that can impact an injury. Similarly, if we turn to the concept of frequency, I'm pulling back now again to our tissue tolerance curves. We see some woman who's working at a checkout stand, and she's going to be repetitively doing this task over and over and over again. Well, we know that over time, if someone does something, we can see accumulation of effects. And so eventually, maybe on the 100th time that she's passed these bags along, well, then she might have some sort of MSD that occurs. And so we try and reduce this. We try and intervene with rest breaks, as well as maybe different changing up the types of tasks that an individual will do in their job. But very similarly, if we think of multiple exposures to some sort of kind of psychological trauma, we can also see psychological injuries someone being at risk for a psychological injury. And so the example I'll give here is that if you had some sort of harassment or bullying in the workplace, and that it was just maybe not the most, it was kind of a low-lying bullying over time, and that repetition happened day in, day out, every time that you came to the workplace, eventually at some point that might lead to a psychological injury within a workplace. And the last piece that I'll pull to is duration. And similarly to the curve that we just saw, if we sit in a certain posture for a prolonged period of time, which I'm sure many of us have throughout the pandemic while we've been working from home, we start to notice that that's sometimes when we start to have an RSI or MSD, because over time, we know that if we're sustaining a certain load, that we can put ourselves at an increased risk for injury. And that very same thing holds at any sort of psychological consideration that we might look at, that if it's sustained or a long duration, that an individual or a worker could be at risk for a psychological injury as well. And so really what I wanted to highlight in these kind of diagrams as we're going through is not only that we know that psychological factors and psychosocial risk factors are similar between these two types of injury, it's that the kind of mechanisms and modifiers and the characteristics of these risk factors can be very similar as well. And that makes it challenging for us when we're trying to measure those in the workplace. And so here, I'm just going to kind of prime us before we head out into our breakout rooms to think about a job that you're familiar with, or maybe one that's kind of been really intriguing for you, that if you're working as an occupational health and safety practitioner, or if it's in your own workplace. And think about kind of some of the risk factors that you've maybe noticed, or ones that you're starting to see that are emerging. And so here I've just given an example of a milling operator and some things that we might start to look at, or maybe the job demands. Maybe they have multiple roles that they need to account for over time. Maybe they're working at a very high work pace. And then there's also these other considerations of posture that we might start looking at, as well as the muscular demands in that. So here, start to think about how these factors might influence one another, and bring your own experiences and examples. Because what we're going to do now is move out into these breakout sessions. So we have over 10 breakout sessions, and we have some facilitators who are going to be there to help guide you along with this, where we're going to categorize some of these psychosocial risk factors. And I do want you to bring some of the factors that you've seen in your own workplaces, or maybe ones that you're like, I'm not sure where this fits. I don't know if it's a psychosocial risk factor. Bring those into the breakout session that we're going into, and let's try and see if we can discuss some of the challenges that you folks are having. So as mentioned, we have a kind of maybe a new platform for some that we're hoping that will work quite well. And this is called Mural. So I'm actually going to just stop sharing this screen. And what I'm going to do is share what this looks like and what you're going to be interacting with. And so Mural is a collaborative online platform in which you can just go on to a hyperlink, and you're going to be on this big kind of whiteboard that we've created that has a bunch of different risk factors for both musculoskeletal and psychological injury. It has a section where you can talk to some of your breakout session colleagues about different challenges and experiences that you're having. And it also lists some tools and assessments to see what you're familiar with or what you're using in practice. And so once you're in Mural, you can, a link will be provided to you. You can register as a guest. You don't have to put your name if you don't wish. You can just go as a kind of visiting character, and it'll get assigned to you. Once you're in here, you can kind of zoom in, and your facilitators are going to actually tell you a little bit about how you can interact with this, but you can move things around. So you can click on sticky notes, you can drag and drop them, you can type in sticky notes, and you can also right click and add comments to chat with some of the folks that are in your breakout groups. So here you can enter and say, hi, I'm experiencing this challenge, and share that with your group. So hopefully this is a fairly easy platform for us to integrate with. We'll give you some time to kind of get used to it and kind of move around with it. You can move most of the things that you see on your slides. So feel free to kind of engage, zoom in and out, and work around on the page. Again, myself and Dwayne will pop through some of the breakout rooms, but you have facilitators that are there to help kind of guide with this. So feel free to ask as many questions, and we do hope that you can learn from one another in some of the challenges you're experiencing with psychosocial factors. So Tiffany, I don't know if you want to start assigning people out, if that's the easiest.
Yes, I am getting ready. So once the room is open, then you will see a message showing up. You're assigned to room number 1 or up to 10. Then you just click go to join. Then you will be going in. So the session is assigned for 30 minutes. So that would be really, really fun to, you could join in. Even you may have some audio and visual devices issue from your end. Don't worry, try to still stick into the room. Maybe you could still observe how that exercise and the conversation about, right? So we just want you to kind of learn from each other and make it really engaging and participatory session. So I'm going to open up the room right now. Enjoy.
Thank you, Tiffany. And also stop recording. All right, so I have it on.
There you go.
All right. Thanks everyone. So welcome back, and thank you, Andrew, for the feedback on that. Forgive me 1 second. So it was interesting to see, and apologies on some of the trickiness with Mural. Some of them were locked, some of them were not. So we had some laughs, I guess, that everything was moving all over the pages, but at least you weren't doing continuously repetitive movements. You should have been moving in different ways. So maybe that's keeping with the RSI prevention today. But we do hope that it was kind of a useful maybe discussion piece if you were able to have some conversations with other colleagues to help with some of the challenges you're having in your own workplaces. What was really interesting for us to see, so Dwayne and I kind of met as you guys were meeting, and we jumped into some of the different rooms, but was to hear kind of the thought processes that are going through when looking and categorizing risk factors. And I heard, I think in one of the breakout sessions that we were talking about, you know, which comes first, kind of a bit of a chicken and an egg discussion where some of these psychological factors may kind of come first and be predisposing to a musculoskeletal injury, or vice versa, in which you might have a musculoskeletal injury that perpetuates some sort of psychological injury. And then at the end of the day, you're kind of stuck with these risk factors, and we could see the sticky notes kind of going back and forth, and then sometimes hedging towards the middle. And so we have a couple screenshots here from a few different groups, but what is I think is great to see is that we see so many of these factors kind of coming into play in both. And I did notice in the chat just before we started into the breakout rooms, one of your colleagues did mention, you know, as a society that we are beginning to understand this relationship, and we have this understanding, but the challenge is that to quantify their impact and bring these all into some sort of paradigm of causation. So Gail, I echo and hear that comment. And it is challenging when we hear these discussions of how people think through the different factors. And so hopefully this is really fruitful for us in our research side of things to try and think about how we can measure and assess these multiple factors and the different kind of levels of causation within them. The second piece, the second piece of the breakout sessions, I do hope that if you had some challenges, I know I heard Andrew suggesting some challenges in his group, some solutions to challenges in his group. So there's lots of available resources through many folks that are in here in this group today. So feel free to kind of if there's things that you're still kind of struggling with, especially kind of in the return to work avenue, in which maybe some of us can help with one another with that. The last piece on the tools was also pretty interesting. And I think this owes kind of to just the differences in what roles we have. I was noticing in that a lot of the groups that some folks had never heard of some of these tools, and we put a mix of both physical and psychosocial tools on here, assessment tools. And the reason there being also the physical risk assessment tools are kind of the ones that Canadian ergonomists would be more familiar with. They're pulled out of the literature, but it really maybe does speak to a bit of a research versus practice gap, in that if we know of all of these through research, like, are they actually helpful and useful for those in the field? Something to consider. So thanks for engaging in the exercise and trying something new. Perhaps room for improvements, but I hope that it was somewhat enjoyable for everyone to be in those sessions. So coming back to kind of where we left off, to identify and assess both types of risk factors, we talked about that we might want to consider some of the different modifiers like the level, frequency, and duration. But further complicating things, and I think this was alluded to in a lot of groups and in the chat, that we also need to consider how these factors may interact. And so here, we'll go back to the image that we were looking at before we jumped into the breakout rooms, and we talked maybe about that work pace could be an important factor maybe at a certain job. And with that, you might see that they have to do their task kind of very quickly, and there could be a bit of a speed accuracy trade-off there. Perhaps individuals in their roles have multiple job demands, and so they're maybe cognitively thinking of other tasks, which could lead to increased stress. Now, if we overlay that with what we know about physical factors, that increased work pace maybe changes someone's posture, which then could influence on a musculoskeletal injury. And those multiple job demands, maybe they're stressing out. And if I know from my experience, when I'm stressed out, I don't hold myself in the best way. And physiologically, biologically, we can see that this creates changes within our musculoskeletal system, such as increased tension and muscle tone. So at the end of the day, when we start to look at all of these different factors together, and this is what we're talking about, is the fact that the psychosocial factors are kind of messy. They overlap one another. And then we're not too sure at the end of the day, is that creating a musculoskeletal or a psychological injury? This becomes one of the further challenges that we're going to contend with in the next kind of few decades, I'm sure, as we know more and more about these types of factors, but it really comes to how do we assess them. And so we highlighted some tools in there, and I did see some comments on an inquiry about these different tools. I will also note that there is an upcoming seminar given by a group, I believe in Ontario, but I will ask for Mike to pop in a link on recent advancements in different tools. So that could be helpful for you folks. But if we're looking at psychosocial risk factors, a lot still are survey and self-report going to workers and employees. And so I've highlighted a few here, and they kind of parallel some of the topics we talked about, being effort reward imbalance and job demands and job content. Some more familiar ones to us are the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, also known as the COPSOC, and this was designed for the assessment improvement of psychosocial conditions. The kind of positives of it is that it can be used in workplaces of any size and sector, and it does have some comparable benchmarks for you to use as references. And then also turning to the psychological health and safety standard, as we kind of have paralleled already, the Guarding Minds at Work survey is supposed to help assess and address some of these psychological health and safety concerns. So going back to that original polling question we had, looking at different psychosocial risk factors, we saw that many of you answered that yes, a lot of these would be relevant to MSI. We saw that also in our breakout sessions. Here we're adapting from the psychological health and safety standard. And so potentially some of the ways that we might be able to address MSIs, psychosocial factors, would be to actually turn to this literature and start to see how those tools could help us. And this is just a kind of fact-finding mission, might be helpful for you, Andrew, in upcoming RSI days, but there is a polling question on if you would be interested in future presentations on risk factor tools and assessments. So I'll let that poll run its course, and hopefully it looks to be that it could be a helpful piece.
Given some of the comments that I've seen go by, it seems
Yeah.
like people are interested in that.
Both physical and the psychosocial.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, for those, last year we had the OCAL put on a demonstration of their psychosocial risk factor checklist. So check out the presentation from last year for those that weren't there, which is a little bit based on the COPSIC and the Scandinavian one.
Right.
All right, so you know what? I'm going to click on share results. Why not? So it's coming up. I'm moderator, so I can't see this.
So as moderator, yes, it seems that there's an 89% would love to see some presentations on risk factor tools and assessments.
Who's the one that says
That
no?
said no.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic. So as a summary, we know that we've kind of said that there's evidence for both. We know, and we knew this kind of leading into this presentation, that psychosocial risk factors are related to MSI. We know that psychosocial risk factors are related to psychological injury. And today we hoped that you could just kind of see how there's modifiers for these and how there are potential interactions, and that you could kind of work through some of the scenarios that you're experiencing with some of the colleagues on this call. What we can do is measure and assess risk factors, but we're going to struggle with some challenges moving forward. And this is kind of the hope that we can address these through research. And so there's likely going to be greater attention to psychosocial risk factors in workplaces. So we need to understand the similarity between these two types of risk factors and develop tools that can help us assess both types. So as a little prelude to what we're working on, Dwayne and I are trying to understand what are the common risk factors. So we are looking at a scoping review of the literature to figure out what risk factors kind of overlap between these two. So very similar to what you were doing with the Venn diagrams. Can we figure out kind of what are the top risk factors that are addressing both types of injury? And then looking to develop a tool that can help us to measure these risk factors that are common to both, and kind of helping workplaces triage the most important or what we consider to be the most important risk factors, as they're going to influence both types of injury. So we thank you for your time today, and we hope that it's been useful for you to communicate with some other colleagues. And we'd love to hear your feedback and information if you're interested in the research that we're doing, or if you have experience with these psychosocial factors. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. So before we get into some questions, and we got 5 minutes left, we do have a draw prize. So everyone stay here, because we're going to do a little random draw. Tiffany's going to do that in just a minute. And before we go away too, we will be sending out a follow-up survey. So check your junk folder and your spam folder the next little while. We would like to hear your thoughts about today and future. So thank you on that. So before we turn over to a couple of questions for Heather and Dwayne, before we finish this, personally, thank you very much. We'll be talking again, do a little debrief, and hope to share some of what all the 10 different groups kind of found. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to everyone else. Questions?
Chat's been fairly quiet.
Okay.
I think there's been some questions and links about just the tools. I think people really like starting there, and at least
Some questions
the work's been done. Yeah,
budgets and how to get things paid. So we'll I'll put a nice little paragraph together and ship that off to people. Okay. Well then, as people are kind of letting this soak in, and I'm sure the questions always come tomorrow and the next week. So we'll let that sink in. Tiffany, would you like to do the draw for the 2 fleece safe work jackets that, again, thank you very much to Safe Work for sponsoring that and donating that. Whoever wins will get your sizes and they'll send it out.
Okay, I am going to get the draw. As we have 201 people registered on my list, so we are going to pick 2 numbers according to my list, which winner will be. Then I will announce it right away. The first winner is Whoa, 166. Right on my list is, whoa, congratulations, Johnston Eerd from Manitoba Liqua and Lotteries Corporation. Congratulations. We'll be
All right,
happy
Jacques.
with you then, Zog.
Very good, Jacques.
Then next one. There you go. Wow, big number. Let's see, 190. Paul Allen from New Fire. Paul, congratulations. So thank you, all of you. So I'm going to stop the screen here. Great, I pass it back to
All right.
you.
So once again, I'd like to thank all the volunteers that started with us in last year, but really got going in November, December, and all the volunteers for the breakout rooms. We did a couple of sessions. Hopefully I'll get some feedback and see how that all went. So to all the safe work people, and of course the Occupational Health Center staff, Tiffany, as you can see in the corner, doing all the background work, and she probably did 90% of this. So thank you, Tiffany, there for making all this happen, and Jeffrey doing the chat room, and then others behind the scenes. Great. And then now one last time to Heather, Dwayne, and Karen. Thank you very much. Thank you for doing this. It really makes our session a lot better. You don't want to hear from me. No one wants to hear from me anymore. That's we like these outside people. So hopefully everyone here in the province, everyone else listening, got elevated. We build your capacity, because that's what the Occupational Center does, right? We're going to try and build your capacity, and we'll keep working with this. We'll keep working with it.
Yeah.
All right. So everyone that participated, thank you. Tiffany, any last words?
Yeah, the last word is thank you so much for all the participation. And also thank you, Safe Up Manitoba, again for sponsoring this event to make that possible. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon and see you next year. Hopefully we will see you guys in person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good.
Bye. Stay safe, everyone.
Congratulations on putting a session together.